A man is strapped to a wooden table in the center of London. His body is being torn apart piece by piece. The king's men offer him a final chance. Kneel, beg for mercy, swear loyalty to the crown, and the pain will stop. Instead, with the last breath left in his lungs, he screams a single word that would echo through history. Freedom! William Wallace. To some, the sacred martyr of Scotland. To others, a violent rebel who plunged nations into bloodshed. But when we examine his life through the lens of philosophy, a deeper question appears. Was Wallace truly free? Or was he a man chained to his own rage, mistaking vengeance for justice? Here at Stoic Lighthouse, we do not chase quick answers or comforting myths. We search for clarity, direction, and inner calm in a chaotic world. So today, the Stoic tribunal opens its doors. Was William Wallace a warrior guided by virtue, like Cato resisting tyranny? Or was he a tragic hero, consumed by passions he could never master? To answer that question, we must examine the evidence. Number 1, standing against the impossible, duty over fear. In 1297, the situation looked hopeless. England possessed one of the most disciplined and professional armies in Europe. Scotland, by comparison, had farmers, blacksmiths, and villagers holding improvised weapons. Logic pointed to surrender, fear pointed to survival. But William Wallace chose something else. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge, he stood at the front of a fragile army and asked ordinary men to face an empire, not because victory was guaranteed, but because submission would have meant accepting a life without dignity. For the Stoics, this moment reveals something important about courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the clarity to know what deserves fear and what does not. Wallace understood that living permanently under tyranny could be worse than dying on the battlefield. In that moment, death became the smaller threat. The philosopher Aristotle described this kind of courage with remarkable precision. Aristotle taught, "The courageous man is the one who faces and fears the right things for the right reason, in the right way, and at the right time." At Stirling Bridge, Wallace acted exactly within that definition. His decision was not reckless chaos. It was a calculated act of defiance rooted in duty. The Stoics used a word for this responsibility, officium, your role in the order of the world. Sometimes that role is quiet, a parent protecting a child, a teacher guiding a student, a citizen defending justice. But sometimes history places someone at the front line of a nation's survival. Marcus Aurelios understood that burden well. As emperor, he spent years on the frozen frontiers of Rome, leading soldiers into brutal conflicts he never sought but could not avoid. Marcus Aurelios reflected, "Do not be shaken. Do your duty as a human being with dignity, seriousness, and sincerity." Wallace seemed to embody that principle. He did not inspire his army with promises of comfort or survival. He inspired them through example, a single man willing to stand where others feared to stand. And in moments like that, something powerful happens. Fear spreads quickly among men, but courage spreads faster. A farmer becomes a soldier, a frightened crowd becomes a united force, and suddenly an empire realizes that power is not measured only in armies, but in the will of those who refuse to kneel. Number 2, refusing tyranny. Integrity, when everyone else kneels. Courage on the battlefield is impressive, but moral courage away from the battlefield is often even rarer. During Wallace's time, Scotland's greatest weakness was not England's army. It was the weakness of its own nobility. Many Scottish lords chose safety over principle. Faced with the power of King Edward I, they accepted land, titles, and protection in exchange for loyalty. Kneeling was easier than resisting. William Wallace had none of those privileges. He was not a great nobleman. He was not born into power. Yet, he refused to kneel. By doing so, he became an outlaw in his own land. Hunted, betrayed, and constantly at risk of execution. but his conscience was not for sale. This kind of defiance echoes one of the most admired figures in Stoic history, Cato the Younger. Cato lived during the collapse of the Roman Republic, when Julius Caesar accumulated power and many senators chose compromise. Cato refused to legitimize what he saw as tyranny, even when resistance meant isolation. For the Stoics, political freedom is not the highest good. Virtue is. But tyranny presents a serious danger to virtue because it pressures people to betray their own moral judgment. When survival requires submission to injustice, the soul begins to erode. The Roman Stoic Seneca reflected deeply on this problem while living under the unpredictable rule of Emperor Nero. Seneca warned, "No man is more enslaved than the one who believes himself free without being so." To the Stoics, true freedom requires refusing to cooperate with corruption, even when obedience would be easier. Wallace understood something similar. The peace offered by England was not peace at all. It was submission disguised as stability. Accept the king's rule, pay the taxes, obey the crown, and the violence would stop. But the price was dignity. Wallace chose uncertainty instead. And history repeatedly shows how rare that decision is. Most people adapt to injustice because resistance is costly. It threatens comfort, status, and sometimes life itself. Yet every generation produces a few individuals who refuse the bargain. If this way of seeing life is resonating with you, it's probably because you're not just looking for entertainment. You're trying to live with more awareness. This channel exists for exactly that reason. For Wallace, integrity was not a slogan. It was a line that could not be crossed. Even when crossing it would have made his life much easier. Number 3, the martyr's death, the ultimate test of the inner citadel. If courage reveals itself in battle, its ultimate proof often appears in suffering. When William Wallace was finally captured in 1305, King Edward I did not intend to simply execute him. The king wanted a spectacle, a warning to anyone who might dare challenge the English crown. Wallace was sentenced to one of the most brutal punishments imaginable. He was dragged through the streets, hanged, disemboweled, and dismembered in front of a crowd. The intention was not only to kill him, but to break him first, to force him to beg, scream, and renounce the cause he had fought for. But Wallace refused. According to both historical accounts and later chronicles, he endured the torture with a terrifying level of composure. Even as his body was destroyed, he did not surrender the one thing his executioners truly wanted: his will. For the Stoics, this moment represents the ultimate test of what they called the inner citadel. The idea that while the body can be harmed, imprisoned, or destroyed, the core of our judgment remains beyond the reach of external force. The Stoic teacher Epictetus understood this better than most. Before becoming a philosopher, he was a slave. His master once twisted his leg so violently that it permanently crippled him. Yet Epictetus later explained the limits of power with striking clarity. Epictetus said, "You may chain my leg, but not even Zeus can conquer my will." The tyrant can control circumstances. He can inflict pain. He can take property, reputation, even life itself. But he cannot command the mind's consent. This same principle appeared centuries later in the life of American naval officer James Stockdale. During the Vietnam War, Stockdale endured years of imprisonment and torture. What allowed him to survive was his deep study of Stoic philosophy, especially the teachings of Epictetus. He understood something his captors never could. They could control his body. They could never control his character. In his final moments, Wallace seemed to embody that same defiant freedom. His execution was meant to display the absolute power of the crown. Instead, it revealed something far more disturbing to tyrants. A man whose body could be destroyed, but whose will could not be conquered. For a Stoic observer, that is the closest a human being can come to true freedom. Number 4, when justice turns into revenge. Until now, the defense has presented a powerful image. a courageous leader, a man of integrity, a martyr who refused to surrender his will. But the prosecution now raises a difficult question. Why did William Wallace begin this war in the first place? In the popular story, and partially supported by historical accounts, the spark that ignited his rebellion was deeply personal. His wife, Murren, was executed by English authorities. Her death shattered whatever fragile peace remained in Wallace's life. From that moment forward, the conflict was no longer only political. It became personal. For the Stoics, this distinction matters more than it might seem. Justice and revenge may look similar on the surface, but they are driven by very different forces. Justice seeks balance and the protection of the common good. Revenge seeks emotional relief. It wants the enemy to suffer so that the wounded heart can feel satisfaction. The Stoics considered this impulse one of the most dangerous passions a human being can harbor. Not because anger never appears, but because when anger becomes the engine of our actions, reason begins to lose control. Seneca, who wrote an entire treatise about anger, described its destructive nature with unsettling precision. Seneca warned, "Anger is an acid that can do more harm to the vessel in which it is stored than to anything on which it is poured." If revenge was the true fuel behind Wallace's rebellion, then his cause becomes morally more complicated. Because anger is powerful. It can mobilize armies, it can ignite revolutions, it can transform ordinary people into fearless fighters. But anger also burns the person who carries it. A Stoic sage does not fight out of hatred. He fights out of duty. Like a surgeon removing a dangerous tumor, he acts firmly, but without personal fury. Marcus Aurelios constantly reminded himself of this principle while commanding Roman legions during brutal frontier wars. Marcus Aurelios reflected, "The best revenge is not to become like your enemy." And this is where the Stoic tribunal begins to hesitate. If Wallace allowed vengeance to shape his inner world, then even while fighting for freedom, he may have surrendered something far more important, his sovereignty over himself. Number 5, the brutality of war, losing our shared humanity. Revolutions rarely remain pure for long. At the beginning, they often start with noble language, freedom, justice, dignity. But as violence escalates, the line between defender and aggressor can slowly begin to blur. Historical records suggest that some of William Wallace's campaigns in northern England were not limited to military targets. Villages were burned, civilians suffered. In one particularly disturbing account, the English treasurer Hugh de Cressingham was reportedly flayed after the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and parts of his skin were used to make a belt for Wallace's sword. Whether every detail of the story is accurate or not, the symbolism is striking. Cruelty had entered the war. For the Stoics, this raises a serious moral problem. Stoic philosophy teaches the principle of sympathia, the idea that all human beings are interconnected parts of a larger rational order. Even enemies belong to the same human family. This does not mean that conflict is always avoidable. The Stoics were not naive about politics or war. Marcus Aurelios himself spent years commanding armies on violent frontiers. But the Stoic warrior must never forget a critical boundary. The enemy is still human. Hatred may be understandable in war, but indulging in cruelty corrupts the soul of the person who commits it. The goal of justice is protection and restoration of order, not the humiliation or dehumanization of another person. The Stoic philosopher Hierocles described humanity as a series of expanding circles of concern: family, community, nation, and ultimately all human beings. Our task, he argued, is to gradually draw others closer within those circles, not push them further away through brutality. When violence crosses into cruelty, something dangerous happens. The war begins to reshape the character of the people fighting it. Modern author Ryan Holiday reflects on this ancient warning when analyzing the moral cost of conflict. Ryan Holiday writes, The goal is not simply to win the war, but to win it without losing yourself. This is the dilemma that now hangs over Wallace's legacy. He may have won victories on the battlefield, but if cruelty became part of his methods, then the question becomes unavoidable. Did he defeat his enemies, or did the war slowly transform him into something closer to them? Number 6, the fatal confusion, political freedom versus inner freedom. William Wallace dedicated his life to a single word: freedom. It was the cry that echoed across battlefields, the ideal that united farmers, rebels, and warriors, the dream that drove him to challenge one of the most powerful empires of his time. But Stoic philosophy forces us to ask a difficult question. What kind of freedom was he fighting for? Political freedom is powerful. It determines laws, rights, and the structure of society. Entire nations rise and fall over it. But for the Stoics, political freedom is not the highest form of freedom. It is something they called an indifferent. Valuable, certainly. Preferable, absolutely, but not the ultimate good, because a person can live in a free republic and still be a slave to fear, greed, jealousy, or anger. And a person can live in chains and still possess an unbreakable inner freedom. The Stoic founder Zeno taught this idea with striking clarity. Zeno taught, freedom is the possession of a mind that governs itself. This is the radical insight of Stoicism. The true prison is not always outside us. Sometimes it exists inside our own emotions. A man who cannot control his anger is not free. A man ruled by envy is not free. A man driven by revenge is not free. He is simply obeying a different master. From this perspective, Wallace's life begins to look like a philosophical paradox. He fought relentlessly to liberate Scotland from English rule. But did he liberate himself from the rule of his own passions? If anger guided his war, if revenge fueled his decisions, if hatred shaped his view of the enemy, then even while shouting freedom, he may have been trapped inside another form of slavery. The Stoics believed the greatest revolution is not political, it is internal, replacing the tyranny of impulse with the rule of reason. Because when a person truly governs their own mind, something extraordinary happens. No king can dominate them, no prison can fully break them, and no external loss can take away their freedom. Number 7, final verdict, the spirit of Cato with the blood of Ares. The Stoic tribunal now delivers its verdict. The case of William Wallace is neither simple nor comfortable. On one side, the defense has shown us a man of undeniable courage, a leader who stood against overwhelming power, a man who refused to kneel when many others chose safety over principle. He faced torture without surrendering his will. In those moments, Wallace demonstrated something profoundly Stoic, the protection of what the philosophers called the inner citadel, the last territory that no tyrant can conquer. But the prosecution has also shown us another side, a man whose rebellion may have been ignited by vengeance, a leader capable of brutal violence in war, a fighter so focused on external freedom that he may have neglected the freedom of his own inner world. So the tribunal must answer the central question. Was William Wallace a Stoic? The answer is no. William Wallace was something far more human. He was a tragic hero. He possessed the defiant spirit of Cato the Younger, the Roman who refused to submit to tyranny even when defeat was inevitable. But flowing through his actions was also the burning blood of Ares, the ancient god of war and uncontrolled fury. This combination made him powerful, but it also made him dangerous. Stoic philosophy teaches that courage alone is not enough. Courage without wisdom can become recklessness. Courage without justice can become cruelty. The Stoics believed that virtue must exist in balance. Wisdom must guide courage. Justice must restrain anger. Temperance must prevent power from becoming destruction. Wallace had the fire. What he lacked was the full discipline required to control that fire. And that is precisely why his story continues to fascinate us centuries later. He reminds us of the immense strength human beings can summon when fighting for something they love. But he also warns us of the danger of letting hatred become the force that guides that fight. Plato once described the human soul as containing a fiery element called thymos, the part that seeks recognition, honor, and justice. Wallace was almost pure thymos, a powerful spirit of resistance, but without the steady guidance of logos, the rational principle that Stoic philosophy places above all passions. He defended Scotland with everything he had, yet he never fully conquered the more difficult battlefield, the one inside himself. William Wallace's story reminds us that fighting for freedom is noble, but Stoicism forces us to ask a harder question. What kind of freedom are we truly pursuing? A person may overthrow a king and still remain a servant of anger. A nation may gain independence while its citizens remain prisoners of envy, fear, and resentment. The Stoics believed that the first tyranny we must defeat is not political. It is internal. Real freedom begins the moment we stop allowing emotions, desires, and external events to command our inner world. Only then does the mind become truly sovereign. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden in Wallace's life. His courage can inspire us. His mistakes can instruct us. But the path of the Stoic asks for something even harder than rebellion: self-mastery. Everything external can be taken from you, but the discipline you build within yourself cannot be conquered. If this reflection stayed with you, consider subscribing and continuing this journey with our community. Let Stoic Lighthouse guide you toward calm, clarity, and wisdom. But before you go, there is another invisible chain that enslaves millions of people today. It does not come from kings or empires. It comes from constantly comparing your life with the lives of others. In the next video, we will examine the Stoic method that can completely destroy envy and restore peace to your mind. As Epictetus reminded his students, freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control. Until the next video.